Good evening and welcome to a very special program. I'm Vishnu Shom. I'm reporting from the Bharat Mandapam site. This is the site where the G20 process is taking place. You can actually see the Bharat Mandapam right behind me over there. That's where leaders of all of these countries, the G20 nations and special invitee states will be meeting tomorrow. But before we talk about the G20 process, it's important to reflect a little bit about what's happening now. The US President Joe Biden has arrived in India. His aircraft, Air Force One, landed a short while back. He got into his special armored vehicle and is now on his way to the residence of the Prime Minister. He should have reached there by now, and talks would have commenced between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the US President Joe Biden. The United States very key to ensure that a couple of the key items which have been discussed between India and the United States in Washington during the recent visit of the Prime Minister, the state visit, are in fact transformed into actual deals. So what are we talking about? Well, we'll discuss that in a little while from now. But first, let's once again turn our attention to the G20 process, and there's a great sense of excitement and anticipation over here. Why? Because the Sherpa of the G20 process, India Sherpa, the key official leading the entire process, Amitabh Kant, seemed to suggest that progress had been made towards arriving at a Delhi declaration for G20. Why is this unusual? It is unusual or difficult simply because there have been sharply conflicting points between several countries on the issue of the Ukraine war. There have been conflicting points on the use of certain language as far as climate change issues are concerned. But Amitabh Kant is confident that the draft which has been arrived at by the Sherpas of various nations is relatively acceptable. However, whether it gets accepted or not as part of a Delhi declaration depends entirely on whether the heads of state who are now coming into India or have already arrived actually go ahead and sign it.
The New Delhi Leaders' Declaration, which many of you will see post the summit, you will see it as a voice of the global south and the developing countries. No document in the world would have such a strong voice for the global south and the developing countries as the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. New Delhi Leaders' Declaration is almost ready. I would not like to dwell on it because this declaration will be recommended to the leaders and the leaders will then accept it. And only after it has been accepted by the leaders.
Well, one of the global leaders who have arrived over here is Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Among the questions that he was asked were on the steps that he is taking to fight the Khalistani threat back home. Here's what he said.
Let me just say unequivocally that no form of extremism or violence like that is acceptable in the UK, and that's why we are working very closely with the Indian government to particularly tackle PKE, pro-Khalistan extremism. I don't think it's right. Our security minister recently was just in India talking to his counterparts. We have working groups together to share intelligence and information so that we can root out this kind of violent extremism. It's not right, and I won't tolerate it in the UK.
Now, I was talking a little while earlier on some of the key deals between India and the United States which are in the works. What are some of the areas that both countries are looking at? The US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan actually has spoken to reporters on the flight Air Force One, bringing in the US President to India, and he said a couple of important things. Firstly, 5G and 6G tech, something India and the US are looking to make meaningful progress on. Jet engine technology. Remember, General Electric has agreed to manufacture GE414 engines for use in the Tejas Mark 1A fighter here in India. If that deal actually materializes, if they actually decide on a final cost, that would be a huge step forward. But that's a time-bound process. It needs to happen because India needs to induct the Tejas Mark 1A fighter. A multi-billion-dollar deal is something that they're looking at for Predator drones, the MQ-9B drone, the Predator Avenger drone, something that is required by the Air Force, the Army and the Navy in order to survey large parts of the boundary between India and China, and also the maritime areas, which are areas of concern. So those are a couple of areas. Also civil nuclear technology that both sides are looking at. Will there be real progress? That's what needs to be looked at very closely indeed. We're joined by several special guests. Jayant Krishna, Senior Fellow in the US-India Policy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Jayant, Krishna, thank you very much for being with us. Professor Scott Lucas, Mukesh Aghi, the CEO and President of the USI SPF, and Sumant Sinha, the Chairperson and CEO of Renew Wind Power, very special guest, joins us because sustainable energy is something that we are looking at very closely at the G20 process. But Jayant Krishna, to you first, realistically, and we now know what the US actually wants, realistically, how many of these deals are expected to take place?
See, Vishnu, as a matter of fact, this being a multilateral forum, G20, so I think on the sidelines of it, the bilaterals are happening. So it will not have the same, intensity as a standalone bilateral in the US or in India. But still, I think there would be hopefully some movement on the jet engine deal between GE and HAL, where 80% technology transfer has been talked about. I think there has to be a movement after it was endorsed by the US Congress as well. There's also expected to be some discussions on joint collaboration in the telecom sector by way of 5G and 6G. Also, the multilateral, financial institutions reforms. While it is a multilateral issue, but it won't move unless US being the biggest funder of these multilateral institutions, it is cleared by them by way of, restructuring of loans, by way of more kitty, enlarging the kitty itself for more money to be available to the developing and poor countries. Also, lower interest rates, things like loans in local currency and so on and so forth. I think that's there. Then also in artificial intelligence, I think the US and China have done much more work than what India has done. But again, some joint collaboration is very, very important. Admission of African Union into G20 is also, I'm sure it will briefly figure, but US and India both have said they are okay with it. I think on student mobility, I think that's very, very important because in-country renewal of H1B visa is something that has to see the light of the day. There was some discussion when the Prime Minister Modi had gone to the US in June.
It's certainly one of the most common talking points. Jayant Krishna, I take a couple of the points that you're mentioning. I just want to keep the strike rotating. Let me go across to Professor Scott Lucas. Professor Lucas, shared concerns between India and the United States and China seems to be playing itself out at various levels. At the G20 level, on several issues, for example, the use of language as far as climate is concerned, but also at the broader geostrategic level, given that America and India have concerns about Chinese expansionism. How does that concern actually underwrite a large part of the growing strategic relationship between both sides?
Well, I think Mr. Krishna was quite right to say that a lot of the important work will be behind the scenes when we talk about specifics regarding military, economic, technological interaction, and both sides want to increase that. I know that in India right now you've got the headline issue, which is that of China, especially given certain provocative statements from the Chinese leadership and Xi Jinping not coming to the summit. I have to say that I don't think publicly China is going to dominate this summit. The Chinese state media, English language state media, didn't even refer to the G20 today. I think that while there are a lot of issues regarding, for example, Chinese aggressive military signals, including against India, while there are a lot of questions in terms of how do you coexist with China's expansionist economic policy, India will carry out a lot of that again behind the scenes. They're doing it publicly, of course, where you talk about, whether it be the Quad, whether it be with other regional groupings, whether it be with the bilateral meetings that the Prime Minister had in France and in the United States recently. But I don't think that you want to bring the idea of confrontation with China front and center at the G20, given so many other issues. And I also have to say that actually the key issue, and the one to watch for the Delhi Declaration, by the way, is actually Ukraine. Most of the G20 members that are there are very concerned about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Of course, India has, for its own reasons, trying to be a balancer, trying to be in the middle of all the parties, has refrained from even calling this an invasion. Last year at the Bali summit, Russia vetoed effectively 2 paragraphs that simply affirmed Ukrainian sovereignty. And I think not just the United States, but European countries, Australia, South Korea, Canada will be looking for India to say, look, even if we can't get a reference to Ukrainian sovereignty in the final communique, we want some type of statement from, let's say, 19 of the 20 members at the G20, or at least 18, everyone except China and Russia, that yes, Ukrainian sovereignty does matter, which indirectly says that the Russian aggression should not be tolerated.
Right. Mukesh Aghi, let's just get back to a couple of key areas that America and India are looking at. Small nuclear reactor technology, that's something that both sides are looking at closely. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So you have to understand the deals which are happening between India and the US is a much more of a structured process here rather than transactional. When Prime Minister Modi visited Washington, D.C., there were almost 108 different initiatives brought in between the two countries.
Do something.
Be on artificial intelligence, quantum computing, or GE deal. And to the specific question you asked on the civil and nuclear deal, this was supposed to be built by Westinghouse. In the last time it was signed in, there was an issue on insurance aspect that was addressed itself, and liability also. And now, as I understand, there are other companies which are interested from the US side building the nuclear plant. So I think that will go on. But I think you have to look at a bigger aspect of the relationship, which I call the structure aspect. We're looking at from a people to people, we're looking at technology transfer, defense, business to business. And more important, you have to understand today, China has stopped using officially iPhone 14. It has created a massive concern in the U.S. industry as to, it also had an impact of almost $200 billion on the market cap of Apple. So U.S. companies are now seriously looking at India as an alternative to de-risk their supply chain and also look at Indian market to cover on the losses in China itself. So I think the momentum is not transactional, it's structural and it's geopolitical.
Mm-hmm.
Suman
Sinha, you deal so closely with the entire issue of climate, sustainable technology, for green technology. In terms of what the government of India actually said today was fairly significant when they said that most countries in the world are nowhere close to reaching their Paris goals. They should be not even halfway to where we should be. How important do you believe that the entire issue of green tech and climate is as far as G20 this year is concerned?
Well, Vishnu, thank you. Look, it's incredibly important. I think that the climate crisis is a real crisis. There is no question about the fact that we are falling behind. Every year we set record temperatures. There are catastrophic weather events and so on that keep happening. So I think it's very clear that we are on an unsustainable path right now. So every opportunity that we get, multilateral opportunities, especially like the one right now with G20, it's very important that the world as a whole comes together and takes positive steps forward. Now, at this point, I think, of course, under the sort of the framework that has been agreed globally, every country has to push forward as best as they can. But nevertheless, on a multilateral basis as well, certain things can be done. I think the first issue that can be discussed at forums like the G20 is the whole issue of multilateral development bank financing. How can multilaterals come together and catalyze more private capital into countries like India, countries in the global south, and make sure that the whole renewables revolution becomes a lot more broad-based than it is right now. So I think that's one area where, as you know, there's a committee that has been set up under the leadership of Mr. N.K. Singh and Larry Summers that hopefully will be submitting a report soon on how this can be achieved. The appointment of Ajay Banga, I think, as head of the World Bank is very positive in that direction. So I think that's the first thing that needs to be looked at. The second thing is, one of the big important areas that is now developed is the issue of green hydrogen. Now, across the world, there are many different definitions of green hydrogen. We need to align all of those. Thirdly, as you know, the European Union is really pushing ahead with things like the CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Tax. We need to make sure that all of those are things that don't disadvantage countries like India or countries from the global south, and that trade continues to flow, and we don't put up non-tariff barriers to having trade. So and that's the third thing that we can look at. The fourth, of course, is to look at the supply chain as a whole, because right now the global supply chain in clean energy is very heavily concentrated within China. And that's really not healthy. Of course, there are geopolitical reasons, but there are other things that happen in the world, things like the pandemic and so on, which can, in fact, impact specific geographies. And so we really need to figure out how to really move that entire supply chain out and diversify it much more. And therefore, the steps that India is taking, for example, to build a robust supply system in India, very critical. It is also critical for us to make sure that There is trade happening in clean tech products across countries like India and the US. And then we also need to find out some ways of aligning the very intensive subsidy programs that are being paid or that countries like the US are coming out with, and make sure that those don't disadvantage countries in the global south. So I think there are many things that need to be discussed and hopefully agreed to really move this ball forward on climate change.
Absolutely. Look, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us. Next couple of days are going to be absolutely critical. But there are several other senior visitors over here, the UN Secretary General over here as well. My colleague Priyanshi Sharma spoke to his spokesperson, and among other questions asked on the entire issue of India and Bharat. If India is going to change its name, the United Nations is going to be one of the agencies that need to process this, because the name India is used internationally and in several fora. Is that at all possible? Here's what he said.
All eyes are on the G20 summit that New Delhi will host this weekend. And ahead of that, we're at the UN House to understand what the United Nations priorities are and what their key recommendations for the G20 nations will be. We're honored to have with us the UN Secretary General spokesperson, Mr. Stefan Dujarric. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us. First things first, what do you think about India's presidency of the G20? The summit is here. We're 1 day away from the summit. What do you think about India's presidency, and what are your hopes from this G20 summit?
Well, the presidency comes at a very critical time because we're in a very difficult time in the world. India is a leading voice in the global south, but India is also a bridge builder politically, geographically, and the themes put forward for this G20 of one family, one earth, one planet are exactly what we need at this time. We live in an increasingly multipolar world, which in itself is not a bad thing, but what we risk and what we fear is a fracture, a great fracture between different blocks. And what we need from the G20 is a single voice, is trying to bring that world back together.
Right. So from the United Nations perspective, sir, what do you think would be the priorities that you would be looking at? Of course, sustainability is one. Climate change has been talked about repeatedly, and that's going to be a focus along with sustainable development and not just economic growth in terms of GDP. So from the UN Secretary General's office, what can you tell us about the priorities from the UN's perspective?
I think the Secretary General will come with two very simple messages on climate and on sustainable development. And that is that we cannot continue with the world the way it is right now, in terms of what we're seeing on climate, in terms of what we're seeing on development. On climate, we just learned that we lived through the hottest summer on record. And it's very important for the Secretary General to be here with very strong messages on climate, with a real I hate to use the word wake-up call, because we've been trying to shake political leaders for a long time now. But exactly. So you kind of need to keep doing it. And if you notice, the Secretary General's language is increasingly strident on climate. The G20 brings together the biggest emitters in the world. 80% of emissions come from G20 countries. So if these political leaders around the table don't have the courage to take the necessary decisions, we're in big trouble. But, we still have time to change course. We still have time to mitigate what is happening with climate. On sustainable development, the Secretary General, I think, is extremely worried that because of COVID, because of the war in Ukraine, the world has gone through a number of severe shocks, and the sustainable development goals are not on track to be met by 2030. He is calling for a $500 million sort of jumpstart stimulus package for the sustainable development. And I think what I know he's also calling for is a reform of the international financial architecture. I think it is very clear that the World Bank, the IMF, all the Bretton Woods institutions were created in an architecture that was based on the world in 1945. The world has evolved, as you well know, and so we need to see that architecture change. We need to see the World Bank and the IMF shareholders allow the banks to take greater risks, to give more investment to developing countries, to help us all, really.
Right, and as you mentioned that we're living in a multipolar world, there are so many geopolitical tensions on multiple fronts, not just one. So if we can address the elephant in the room now, what do you think is the possibility of coming to a joint statement in such a scenario when so many countries aren't on the same page on so many facets?
Well, we very much hope that the Indian leadership will guide the 19 other members to a joint statement. It is very important to have that single voice and that single statement come out. And we know that member states, the members of the G20, are hard at work on that.
Right. So the Indian side is confident. There was just a press conference by the External Affairs Ministry, and they said that the joint statement is ready. The New Delhi Declaration, as it has been called, it's ready. It's going to be handed over to the leaders, and they are confident that the leaders are going to accept it. Are you confident? Do you have any sense as of now on what do you think? Can there be a joint statement this time? Because for the last few meetings, we've seen these countries can't come together on one.
We can't tell the future, but we are participating as observers in a lot of these discussions. But ultimately, it'll be up to the G20 leaders, the leaders of the 20 largest economies in the world, who have, of course, a very large political voice as well, and we very much hope that they will come together.
So what do you think India can do to make this happen, to make a joint statement possible? What do you think India's role in making a joint statement possible can be?
I mean, I think it's not for us to tell India what the Indian Foreign Ministry, Indian Prime Minister, what they have to do. What we rely on is, I think, the wisdom of the Indian leadership and their experience as bridge builders.
Right. So from the Indian side, if let's consider a possibility, if there's a joint statement, considering what the Indian side is saying that that's a possibility, then how transformational do you think it would be for the world at large, considering geopolitical tensions, considering climate change? So how transformational could a joint statement prove for the world economy at large?
I mean, I think it'll be a very important step. But what will be more important, in a sense, is what's in the statement.
So that's still, we don't know much about it, the New Delhi Declaration. My last question to you, sir, one topic that's slightly off G20, but that has been much talked about here in India, and that is something that has happened in other countries as well. The talk of changing the country's official name from India to Bharat. Right. What does the UN think about that?
Well, it's not for us to tell countries how they want to be called in official settings. We've seen other countries inform the UN that they want their name changed and how they refer to, but this is a question for Indians themselves to decide.
So several countries have changed their names, and if India does it, that won't be completely new.
Well, I mean, we've seen it throughout history. We know that countries have changed names. They all have their internal processes to do that. Countries then inform us that this process has taken place, and we act upon it.
Right. Can you give us a preview of what the Secretary General would be speaking about today? Last question.
Well, I mean, it's sort of what I highlighted already. I think it's his strong message to the leaders, the fact that we live in a very dangerous moment, and that he is very fearful of a fracture, right, of two groups or three groups of nations with separate economic systems, separate approaches to things like artificial intelligence, to technology, separate approaches to how to fight climate change. I mean, right now, the challenges that we all face, right, if you look at technology and artificial intelligence, if you look at climate change, if you look at global health pandemic, how can anyone think that you can solve these problems by not bringing the whole world together?
These countries that make up around more than 80% of the global GDP and emissions. Thanks very much, Mr. Stephen, for speaking to us.
Care.
Thanks very much. So as you heard from the UN Secretary General's spokesperson, that their priorities for the G20 this time, sustainability, climate change, and sustainable economic growth. Along with that, an important word coming in that India is seen as a bridge builder, and of course all eyes on whether a joint statement will be agreed on. In New Delhi, with camera person Ashwini Mehra, Priyanshi Sharma for NDTV.